Hi, hello everyone, and welcome to our third lecture in the Yiddish and Trances series. Today we are going to explore one of the most fascinating aspects of modern Yiddish literature, how a language that many dismissed as provincial and backwards became a laboratory for radical artistic experimentation. We'll explore Yiddish modernism and Yiddish avant-garde. This is The Crowd, or Revolution, painted by the English artist Wyndham Lewis. Lewis was involved in the British modern art movement Verticism, of which he was a founder and leading figure. This painting shows us the crowd as pure geometry. The technique reflects its historical moment. But first, let's consider the context of this series to understand this image also. In our first lectures, we've traced the journey of Yiddish press and literature from small towns to the metropolis, from Eastern Europe to the United States. We explored how the Yiddish press created new readership across continents, how serialized novels brought modern narratives to immigrant audiences, and how Yiddish writers elevated Yiddish to a language capable of modern literary expression. Today, we'll discuss this innovative literary expression through the lens of Yiddish poetry, perhaps the most far-reaching genre of Yiddish modernism. Now let's go back to the painting, since it captures something essential about the modernist moment we'll be exploring today. The fragmentation of traditional forms, the experience of urban modernity, and the sense of being swept up in forces larger than ourselves is part of the modern experience. Look at how Lewis breaks down the human figure into geometric planes, how the crowd becomes an abstraction of movement and energy. This is the world that Yiddish modernist writers inhabited and transformed into literature. They took this visual language of fragmentation, urbanism, and dislocation and reimagined it in Yiddish verse and Yiddish prose. Modern Yiddish writers actively collaborated with visual artists and were influenced by literary and artistic trends, and we'll see more about this soon. How did Yiddish writers engage with modernism and avant-garde? How did they take Yiddish and use it to create works that were in dialogue with experimental literature in Paris, Berlin, London, New York, and Moscow? This is our question for today's lecture. And as we look at this painting from 1914 or 1915, we might also want to ask, what color did Yiddish modernist poets give to the era, especially to the years following World War I? This is not a rhetorical question. Yiddish modernist poetry looked at reality through the lens of materiality, including colors and textures, shapes and materials, time and space. If this slide looks familiar, it's because we already saw it in the first lecture. This is the map of Yiddish speakers in the world before World War II. There were almost 11 million Yiddish speakers around the world at that time. Today, we'll discuss the yellow circle, Yiddish culture and literature in Eastern Europe. We'll focus on Warsaw and Lviv, but with an eye on New York too. Let's begin with the key features of modernism as it is manifested in Yiddish literature. When we use the word modernism, we're talking about a cluster of aesthetic and philosophical commitments. First, the rejection of the past and search for new forms of expression. Second, fragmentation in form and content. Yiddish modernists broke apart conventional syntax, narrative, and even the visual appearance on the page. For Yiddish writers, this fragmentation also mirrored the literal fragmentation of Jewish individuals, families, and communities. Third, themes of grief and loss. While all modernism grapples with loss, Yiddish modernism had particular losses to mourn. The destruction of communities in World War I and the Russian Civil War, the pogroms of 1918 and 1921, and the sense of a world that could never be recovered. And fourth, the urban experience. Yiddish modernists wrote about New York's skyscrapers, Warsaw's cafes, Paris's rivers and bridges, and more. The city became both liberating and annihilating. And fifth, focus on individual consciousness rather than the collective. The modernist turn toward the individual and the self was one of the key markers of modernism in general and in Yiddish modernism particularly. However, modernist Yiddish writers were also engaged in a complex, often contradictory dialogue with Jewish tradition, even if they broke from it. Look at this remarkable cover from the Avant-Garde journal Chaliastra, The Gang, published in Paris in 1924. The title itself is provocative. The Gang suggests a band of rebels, outlaws, revolutionaries. The literary group Chaliastra was active in Warsaw in the early 1920s. The main writers in the group were Peretz Markish, Melech Ravitch, and Uri Tzvi Greenberg. Notice several key elements in this journal cover. First, innovation in the visual appearance and design. The cover features bold, angular designs. Second, look at the Eiffel Tower, the quintessential symbol of urban modernity, of Paris as the capital of the avant-garde. But notice the Yiddish letters climbing it like acrobats, reading Paris and Chaliastre, as if occupying the Eiffel Tower. Third, the playfulness. There's humor here, a sense of joy and innovation. There was genuine excitement about creating something new. These writers and artists were claiming a place at a table of world literature, insisting that Yiddish belonged in the conversation about artistic innovation. By the way, this cover was painted by a young artist called Marc Chagall. If we think about this cover more deeply, it connects to something crucial about Yiddish modernism and Yiddish avant-garde. Its deep engagement with visual art. The text and the image were intertwined. Books, journals, and other publications were total aesthetic objects, where text and image were equal partners. This matters because the technique of visual modernism, like collage, montage, fragmentation, and geometric lines, became central to Yiddish modernist writing itself. Let's think about collage. The artist takes fragments from different sources, contexts, and textures, and places them together side by side. The fragments don't blend seamlessly. You can still see the different textures, often without one coherent image. For modernist Yiddish writers, these techniques reflected something biographical, even existential. They were born during the last decades of the 19th century and were brought up in a Jewish traditional education. Their families, or themselves, moved from the shtetl to the big city, maybe even crossed the Atlantic. They often read contemporary literature in the languages in which it was written: Russian, French, German, Polish, or English. They were part of the old world and the new. Yet, so many young men and women in their generation came of age in an era of destruction and a fragmented reality. They were thrown into World War I and swept up in revolutionary fervor. They witnessed horrible violence and dramatic geopolitical shifts. The old world and the new existed simultaneously in their consciousness. So, if we want to understand Yiddish modernism, we need to grasp the specific historical context in which it emerged. This modernism was forged in blood and fire. And in the context of interwar Europe, there were many upheavals. First, massive displacement. World War I had uprooted millions. The front lines moved back and forth. Entire towns were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of Jews fled westward or were forcibly evacuated. The geopolitical conditions changed dramatically. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire collapsed. The Russian Revolution and the establishment of the Soviet Union and the Second Polish Republic was established too, to name just a few. The Russian Revolution of 1917 initially seemed to promise Jewish equality and opportunities for Jews. Many Jewish intellectuals, including writers, threw themselves into revolutionary politics. But the civil war that followed brought new horrors. Pogroms carried out by Ukrainian nationalists and other groups. The year 1919, which appears in the titles of poems we'll read today, was particularly horrific. And last, migration. Jewish survivors scattered. New York emerged as the largest Yiddish-speaking city in the world by 1920. Paris became a center for refugee intellectuals, as well as Berlin. Warsaw rebuilt itself as a major Yiddish cultural hub. Moscow attracted Jewish communists who believed in the Soviet promise. Each of these cities developed distinctive Yiddish modernist circles. And there was also the linguistic issue, of course. In the aftermath of the war and the revolutions, the question of Jewish languages became even more urgent. Should Jewish literature be written in Yiddish, the language of the masses, or in Hebrew, the language of Zionist revival? Fierce debates were discussing the question, which one of them is actually the language of the future? Or should it be any of the languages in which Jews lived and knew, like the languages we mentioned before, Russian, Polish, German, French, or English? So the choice of modernist and avant-garde writers to write poetry in Yiddish was a political and cultural statement about what Yiddish literature was and what it could become. Now let me introduce to you Peretz Markish, born in 1895 and murdered in 1952, one of the most electrifying and tragic figures in Yiddish modernism. Born in Polon, Volhynia, in the Russian Empire, today's Ukraine, Markish came of age amid catastrophes. During World War I, he was drafted into the Russian army. He witnessed the war's devastation of Jewish communities, the chaos of the Russian Revolution, and the pogroms of 1918. His early work, especially the collection The Hip, Die Kuppe from 1921, is characterized by explosive imagery, fragmented syntax, apocalyptic vision, and a sense that the very foundations of reality have cracked. Now we'll look at this poem from his 1919 collection Schwellen, Thresholds, written in the immediate aftermath of the pogroms. I'll read the Yiddish original and then the English translation. Weiß ich nicht, ich bin der Heim, sind der Fremd. Ich läuf. Zerspielt ist mein Hemd, Nicht auf mir kein Zäum. Ich bin keinem's nicht. Ich bin Hefker. Ohne Einheb, ohne Sof. Mein Guf ist Schäum. Und es schmeckt von ihm mit Wind. Mein Nomen ist Azind. Zerworf ich meine Hand, der langen sei die Welt von ein Eck bis ins Zweiten. Die Augen schloss gewendet, vertrinken sei die Welt von unten bis herauf. Mit Augen offene, mit zerspielt Hemd, mit Hand zerspreite. Weiß ich nicht. Ich habe heim, ich habe fremd, ich bin ein Unheib, ich Sof. I'll now read the English translation. Don't know if I'm at home or if I'm afar. I'm running. My shirt's unbuttoned. There are no reins on me. I'm nobody's. I'm unclaimed. Without a beginning, without an end. My body is foam, and it reeks of wind. My name is Now. If I throw out my hands, they'd give the world a smack from one end to the other. My eyes, if I let roam about, they'd guzzle down the world from the bottom up. With open eyes, with an unbuttoned shirt, with hands stretched out, I don't know if I have a home or have a far, if I'm a beginning or an end. This poem, written in 1919, is the poem of the hour, almost literally. First, we see here this location. The poet doesn't know where he is, if he's at home or elsewhere. Moreover, he doesn't know if he belongs anywhere. Ich bin keinem's nicht. Ich bin Hefker. I'm nobody's. I'm unclaimed. The Hebrew word Hefker suggests not only the feeling of not belonging, but of being ownerless, without any context. In Jewish law, only property can be defined as Hefker, ownerless. But here, the individual is estranged to the degree of objectivization. And the fragmentation is not only in space, but also in time. On an onheib, on a sof, without a beginning, without an end. And then the body itself dissolves. My body is foam, to the point that the physical existence is not secure anymore. And then comes the line, my nomen is Atzind. My name is Now. This is modernism in 4 words. I am now, said the poet. I am the now. Notice also how the body becomes unstable. My body is foam, and it reeks of wind. The physical self dissolves into something insubstantial, and what remains is a pure present tense existence. My name is now. Only time. Toward the end of the poem, the poet loses completely the sense of space. Weiß ich nicht, ich habe heim, ich habe fremd. I don't know if I have a home or have a far. In the beginning of the poem, he wondered if he was at home or afar. Now he questions whether they existed in the first place. And the disappearance of the space continues with the disappearance of time. Ich bin an onheib, sof. If I'm a beginning or an end. The self, the individual, has no layout, and he can't locate himself in time. Is he the beginning of history? Is he the end of time? Reality has been fragmented to the point of no coherent self-perception. In this poem, Markish demonstrates something crucial. Yiddish can express the most radical dislocation. It can capture the fragmentation of modern consciousness. It can create formally innovative poetry that stands alongside any European avant-garde. Tragically, Markish's story has a terrible ending. He spent most of his career in the Soviet Union, becoming a celebrated Soviet Yiddish writer. But in 1952, during Stalin's purge of Jewish intellectuals, he was arrested along with other members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. He was executed on August 12, 1952, part of the Night of the Murdered Poets. In the interwar period, as we said, New York became one of the most important centers of Yiddish modernism, if not the most important one. If you take a look at this map showing Manhattan's dense urban grid, you can show that by 1920, this landscape was home to over 1.5 million Jews. Most of them were Yiddish speakers immigrants, or second generation. Here emerged the literary group Inzich, literally in the self, introspectivists, led by the poets Yankov Gladstein, Aaron Glantz Leelis, and Nochem Baruch Minkov. Inzich was an interwar movement, and their journal, Inzich, overlapped with the interwar period between 1919 and 1939. Their manifesto stressed the right to write about anything, not just Jewish topics. They insisted on formal innovation. They proclaimed that the individual consciousness, not the collective folk soul, should be at the center of Yiddish poetry. If we write in Yiddish, they said, then it's Yiddish poetry. It doesn't matter what the subject of the poem is. Founded in 1919, the same year as Markish's first collection, the same year of the worst pogroms, the Inzichists represented a different response to historical events. Look at this issue from 1937. Notice the clean, modernist typography. The American Yiddish introspectivists were influenced by American poets and literary magazines like Poetry, which was established in 1912, and other contemporary modernist writers. If you look closely at this issue, you could also see a poem by the Yiddish poet Devora Fogel, which we will discuss soon. Yankov Gladstein, born in 1896 and died in 1971, was the leading theorist and arguably the greatest poet of the Inzichist movement. Born in Lublin, he immigrated to New York just before World War I closed the borders. He spent most of his life in New York, becoming a central figure in American Yiddish literary life. His poem, 1919, gives us a perfect example of Inzichist aesthetics: introspective, formally innovative, grappling with historical events through the lens of the individual. Let's read the original in Yiddish and then the English translation. 1919. Die letzte Zeit ist kein Spur nicht mehr geblieben von Jankel Bravitzchak, nur ein Kleinschick Pintele a Keilekdix, wo es keikelt sich zur Dulterheit über Gassen mit aufgechappete, umgelumperte Glieder. Der Oberhaar hat mit dem Himmelbläu die ganze Erde herumgeringelt und ich tok keine Rettung. Umetum fallen Extras von Oven und zerplatschen mein wasserdicken Kopf. Und einer mit der langer Zunge hat mit der Stickreut meine Brillen auf ewig befleckt. Und reut. Ihr hört, und die Tag wird etwas Säuns in mein Kopf platzen. Und mit Tempen kroch sich anziehen dort, ein überlassen a Kupke schmutzeligen Asch. Und ich, das keilig dicke Pintele, will sich drehen in Äther auf Ewigkeiten, mit reute Wollen herumgehielt. Now let's read the English translation. 1919. Lately, there is no trace left of Yael, son of Yitzchak, but for a tiny round dot that waltzed crazily through the streets with hooked-on clumsy limbs. The Lord above surrounded the whole world with heaven blue, and there is no escape. Everywhere extras fall from above and squash my watery head, and someone's long tongue has stained my glasses for good with a smear of red, and red. You see, one of these days something will explode in my head, ignite. There will be a dull crash, and leave behind a heap of dirty ashes. And I, the tiny dot, will spin in ether for eternities, wrapped in red veils. The poem opens with Yael, son of Yitzchak, a traditional Jewish way of naming, personal name and patronymic. It establishes identity through lineage, through family, through tradition. The poem announces that this traditional identity has been reduced to nearly nothing, to a tiny round dot. But it is also Gladstein's name. He was Yael, and his father was Yitzchak. So while this poem is abstract and modernist, it also, at its core, very, very personal. So first, we have here a geometric reduction. The human being, with all its complexity, history, and relationships, has been reduced to a simplest possible form, a dot, a point, almost an abstraction. It is also, as Binyamin Arshav noted, das Pintele Yid, the tiny Jewish dot that exists in every Jew. But notice something else. The reduction to a dot is also a kind of abstraction. Gladstein is doing verbally what Cubist painters were doing visually, breaking down the human figure into its most basic form. The geometric reduction reflects historical violence. When identity is smashed under the weight of catastrophe, those falling newspapers announcing pogroms and other bad news, what's left is a bare minimum, a point, a dot, still spinning, but stripped of everything that made it human. Second, we see here mobility without direction. This dot rolls crazily through the streets. It's in motion, but the motion is random, purposeless, out of control. This is urban alienation made literal. Third, the mismatch between body and self. The dot has hooked-on, clumsy limbs. The body parts don't fit together coherently anymore. The self is literally falling apart, held together only provisionally. This relates to Markish's foamy body from the previous poem. And now to the next section. Everywhere extras fall from above. Extras are the special newspaper editions announcing urgent news. If you remember a previous lecture on the Yiddish press, newspapers were central to immigrant life, the way people learned about the world, about the Alter Heim, the old home, and their families. But here, they're not sources of information. They're weapons, bombs falling from the sky. And the news they announced? In 1919, it would have been news of pogroms, of massacres, of violence, and they squash my watery head. The self, already dissolved to a dot, is now crushed under the weight of catastrophic news. The repetition of red is crucial. It brings us back to the question I asked in the beginning of this lecture. What is the color of modernity? What is the color of the era? For Gladstone, it is red. Red is blood, obviously, of war and death. It is also the red of revolution, the red flag of communism, which promised liberation but brought new violence, and the color of trauma. The world seen through blood-stained glasses for good. The stain is permanent. And yet the dot persists, and I, the tiny dot, will spin in ether for eternities. The eternal spinning, eternal wrapping in red veils of blood and violence seems inescapable. Remarkably, this is Gladstone's first publication. He offers individual consciousness, fragmentation, trauma, and a kind of terrible persistence without resolution or redemption. This is modernism in Yiddish. Meantime in Galicia. In the aftermath of World War I, the historic region of Galicia, which was part of the Habsburg Empire, was now divided between Ukraine and Poland. In Galicia, too, there was Yiddish culture, and it didn't cease to exist after the war. So now I want to introduce to you a very unique figure in Yiddish modernism from Galicia, Devorah Fogel. Fogel was born in 1900 in Burstein, in Yiddish Bernstein, a small town in eastern Galicia, now in Ukraine. She grew up in Lviv or Lemberg, also now in Ukraine. She wrote in Hebrew, German, Polish, and in Yiddish. Fogel published poetry in Yiddish and Polish literary journals throughout the 1930s and translated Yiddish poetry into Polish. In 1942, she was murdered in the ghetto of Lviv, along with her husband, her son, and her mother. Fogel was in touch with the introspectivists in New York. She corresponded with them and published her poems in Itzik, as we saw earlier in the 1937 issue, and other issues as well. She also translated Yiddish poetry into Polish. For Fogel, Yiddish modernism was a transatlantic project. Devora Fogel published 2 collections of Yiddish poetry and 1 collection of montages, lyric prose. This collection, Acacia's Bloom, was published in Yiddish in 1935 and in Polish in 1936. Now let's look at one of her poems called Lied von Bernstein, a poem about amber. So again, here I'll read the Yiddish first. Lied von Bernstein. Geller Bernstein is a Bäumtrer, was bejomert a goldenem Käfer. Schmeckt mit kleppiger Giffice von gelle Teg, in welches kon als geschehen, und mit groen Stoff von Teg, wenn's ist schon gleich als Ding. In seine Kiele Krellen liegen verschlossen kleppige 17 von 30 Teg, kleppige Tropfen Verzicht. A poem about amber. Yellow amber is a tear of a tree which mourns the golden beetle. It smells of sticky resin, of yellow days, when everything can happen, and of gray matter of days, when it's all the same. In its cool cracks, sticky sides of 30 days lie enclosed, sticky drops of renunciation. The opening line gives us a complex chain of metaphors. The amber mourns the golden beetle. This requires some explanation. Amber sometimes contains insects preserved for millions of years. The beetle, once alive, is now frozen in the amber stone, beautiful and dead. It smells of sticky resin. Fogel appeals to smell, a sense that's connected to memory. It also reminds us of Markish's lines, "My body is foam and it reeks of wind." Though the translation is different in these poems, in the Yiddish original it is the same word, schmeckt mit, smells with. The poem then develops a temporal contrast. Yellow days, when everything can happen, versus gray matter of days, when it's all the same. Yellow days suggest possibility and refer to the yellow amber. The gray matter suggests both colorlessness and materiality. The phrase 30 days could reference to the Jewish period of mourning, shloshim, the 30 days after a death during which certain mourning practices are observed. So we have ritualized grief preserved in amber. Fogel gives us a different kind of modernism from Markish's explosive expressionism or Gladstein's introspective fragmentation. The amber becomes a figure for multiple things simultaneously. The word Bernstein is both an amber, and it is also the Yiddish pronunciation of Burstein, Fogel's hometown. This makes the metaphor and the poem even more moving. If we were to ask Fogel what's the color of modernity, what's the color of the era, she might have said gray or yellow, the gray color of monotony, and the yellow-gray of renunciation and longing. Today's lecture brought us to the heart of what we mean by Yiddish in transit. We've seen how Yiddish itself was literally in transit, moving from Volhynia to Warsaw and Moscow, from Lublin to New York, from Galicia to Paris and Lvov. But more profoundly, we've seen how Yiddish was in transit between tradition and modernity, combining Jewish traditional infrastructure with modern language and poetic techniques. Markish's running body, Gladstein's spinning dot, Fogel's fossilized amber, these are all figures of transit, of being caught between time and space, and of movement without any clear destination. But this state of being in between, or in the now, wasn't just a transitional phase. For many of these writers, it became permanent. They couldn't go back to the world of tradition. It had been destroyed both literally in pogroms and figuratively through modernization and migration. But they also couldn't fully be part of the modern context and thrive in it. Think about Gladstein in New York. He immigrated. He became an introspective poet focused on individual consciousness. In 1919, he is still Yankel's son of Yitzchok, defined by lineage, by tradition. Even as that identity fragments into a spinning dot. He writes about anything human, but he writes in Yiddish. And by the end of the 1930s, he had abandoned his aim to move away from Jewish themes and imagery, and the second half of his writing career was unmistakably preoccupied with Jewish tradition, Jewish history, Jewish laws, and Jewish poetics. The cultural avant-garde in Lvov, Moscow, Warsaw, and New York had a short life. Like its carrier, Yiddish modernism itself was a tiny dot, a foamy body. Its name was now. Yet, it had a remarkable force and inspiration for the next generations. Next time, we'll move from the public space of avant-garde revolution to the intimate space of the mother singing to her child, from the poets trying to forget their past to the mother trying to remember and remind. We'll discuss Yiddish lullabies, transmitters of cultures. Thank you for joining us.